3 true scary stories from Reddit that will leave you terrified. There's a dark corner of the internet where fear is given a voice, a space where the bravest among us share their most terrifying real-life experiences. These stories are not crafted for cinematic thrills or fictional frights. They're raw, unfiltered glimpses into moments of horror that defy explanation. Each tale is a thread in a tapestry of dread, woven with the kind of truth that makes you double-check your locks at night and leaves a lasting imprint on the back of your mind. But before we begin, let me ask you this. Are you ready to confront the fear? Let me take you on a journey into the ordinary turned sinister, a world where everyday lives are interrupted by the inexplicable, the chilling, and the downright haunting. These tales, each more unsettling than the last, remind us of the fragile line between normalcy and nightmare. The stories you're about to hear explore the moments when the familiar becomes the enemy, where the safety of home is pierced by shadows and the comfort of routine is shattered by whispers in the dark. They're the kind of stories that start slow, like a shiver creeping up your spine, and build into a crescendo of pure terror. Fear, as we'll discover, isn't always a roaring beast. Often, it's the soft knock at your window, the misplaced object in your home, or the flicker of a light in an empty house. It's rooted in the small, seemingly insignificant moments that snowball into something unforgettable. This isn't just about the unknown. It's about us, our instincts, our resilience, and our vulnerability. It's about how we cope when the darkness pushes in and the shadows seem alive. These tales might make you question the creak in your floorboards or the flicker of your lights tonight. And perhaps that's the real power of these stories. They don't just scare us, they make us feel alive. Fear, after all, is a reminder of our humanity, a primal instinct meant to keep us safe. So, lean in, let the chills settle over you, and prepare yourself for the truths that lurk in the dark corners of our world. Are you sure you're ready? Because once you step into this realm, there's no turning back. Story 1. The Silent Stalker. Claire had always found solace in routines. As a schoolteacher, her days were structured, predictable, and safe. After a breakup, the move to a quiet suburban neighborhood was supposed to be a fresh start. The streets were lined with golden autumn leaves, and the air smelled of wood smoke and impending frost. The small house she rented was everything she had dreamed of, modest, charming, and enveloped in a comforting silence. But the silence didn't last long. It started with little things. A window in the kitchen, which she was certain she had closed, would be slightly ajar in the morning. A photo frame on the mantel would be tilted ever so slightly. The cozy throw she always left folded on her couch would be strewn across the armrest. Claire laughed these off at first. New places took time to get used to, and surely she was simply adjusting, until she noticed the footprints. One drizzly evening, as she walked up her driveway, she spotted faint, muddy prints near her front door. They were large, unmistakably human, and fresh. Claire froze, clutching her bag. She hadn't ordered any deliveries, and no visitors had been by. Swallowing her unease, she chalked it up to a neighbor taking a shortcut through her yard. Still, the creeping sensation lingered. That night, as she graded papers at her kitchen table, she heard it for the first time, a soft knock at the back door. Startled, Claire looked up. The knock came again, so faint it could have been mistaken for the wind. She got up, her heartbeat quickening, and flipped on the porch light. The backyard was empty, just shadows cast by the swaying branches of the oak tree. The knocking persisted over the next few nights, always faint, always at odd hours. Claire's unease grew, the rational explanations she had clung to starting to crumble. Then came the whispers. One night, while lying in bed, she thought she heard her name, a low, drawn-out Claire, whispered from the hallway. Her blood ran cold as she sat up, straining to listen. Silence. Gathering her courage, she grabbed the flashlight. She kept by her bed and crept toward the hallway. There was no one there. The incidents escalated. One morning, she found her bathroom mirror fogged up with the word HI scrawled across it. Claire hadn't showered yet. Another time, she woke up to find all the lights in her house turned on, despite turning them off before bed. Claire confided in her friend Rachel, who brushed it off as nerves. "You're just on edge from the move and being alone," Rachel said. "It's probably nothing," but it didn't feel like nothing. It felt like being watched, like her every move was under scrutiny. One afternoon, Claire decided to install a security camera. She positioned it by her front door, hoping it would catch whoever, or whatever, was behind these strange occurrences. That night, as the knocking returned, Claire stared at her monitor, her stomach in knots. The screen showed only darkness and the empty porch, except for one moment, a fleeting shadow at the edge of the frame. It wasn't an animal or a trick of the light. It was human. Claire's breath hitched. She rewound the footage and paused it, staring at the blurry figure partially obscured by the porch column. It was too dark to make out details, but the figure's deliberate movements sent a chill down her spine. Someone was out there, watching her. Her heart pounded as she locked all the doors and windows. For the first time since moving in, the little house didn't feel like a sanctuary. It felt like a trap. She called the police, explaining the strange occurrences and the shadow on her camera. The officer who arrived was kind, but skeptical. "Probably just a prankster," he said, shining his flashlight around the property. "Let us know if it happens again." But Claire knew it wasn't a prank. The feeling of being watched was too intense, too real. And as she lay in bed that night, clutching a kitchen knife under her pillow, she realized she wasn't just uneasy. She was terrified. Claire had always believed that technology offered a sense of security. The newly installed security camera provided a fragile illusion of control, a watchful eye over her home when her own failed. Each morning, she checked the footage. Days passed uneventfully. No knocks, no whispers, no signs of the intruder. It was almost as if the installation of the camera had scared them away. Until the night it didn't. Claire had gone to bed early, exhaustion overtaking her. For the first time in weeks, she felt a faint glimmer of peace. But that peace shattered at 2:34 a.m. The familiar knocking returned, louder this time, sharp, deliberate. Adrenaline surged through her veins as she scrambled out of bed and reached for her laptop, pulling up the live feed from the camera. At first, the screen displayed only the dimly lit porch, swaying shadows from the tree outside, and the faint outline of her welcome mat. But then, her heart nearly stopped. A figure stepped into view, tall and cloaked in shadow. The intruder lingered, their features obscured by a hoodie pulled low over their face. They didn't move, didn't knock again, just stood there, facing the door, their presence more chilling than any noise could be. Claire froze, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She reached for her phone to call the police, but hesitated. The figure hadn't done anything yet. The figure slowly tilted their head upward. Claire's stomach churned as she realized they were staring directly into the camera. And then they disappeared, vanishing into the darkness beyond the porch light's reach. The next morning, she reviewed the footage, hoping for clarity. What she found made her blood run cold. The figure didn't leave after stepping out of view. Instead, they circled the house. The camera by her bedroom window captured it, a dark silhouette standing perfectly still, watching her through the thin curtain for hours. Claire felt exposed, violated. The police returned, but their investigation turned up nothing. No footprints, no fingerprints, no sign of forced entry. The officers assured her they would patrol the area, but their skeptical glances betrayed their disbelief. Determined not to be a passive victim, Claire made a decision. That night, she would stay awake. She would face the fear, even if it meant confronting the stalker head-on. Armed with a baseball bat and her phone on speed dial, Claire sat on the couch, every muscle in her body tense. The hours crawled by, each creak of the house making her jump. Midnight passed, then 1 a.m. At 2:34 a.m., the knocking began. The sound was deliberate, louder than ever. Claire's hands trembled as she approached the door, her bat gripped tightly. She pressed her eye to the peephole. The porch was empty. The knocking continued. Summoning every ounce of courage, Claire unlocked the door and yanked it open. The cold night air hit her like a wall, but no one was there. Only the note on the ground. Scrawled in uneven, jagged letters, it read, "I'm always watching." Claire slammed the door, bolting it shut as she collapsed against it, her heart racing. She called the police again, her voice shaking as she recounted what had happened. This time, they scoured the area with more urgency. But just like before, there was nothing. No footprints. No signs of anyone being there. As the officers left, Claire sat on her couch, clutching the note. The words seemed to mock her, a cruel reminder of her vulnerability. The camera had captured the note being placed, but the figure was a mere blur, as if reality itself distorted around them. Days turned into weeks, and the incident stopped. But Claire could never shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow held menace. Every knock on the door made her jump. The question gnawed at her. Was the stalker even human? Claire would never know. And perhaps that was the most terrifying part of all. Story 2. The Vanishing Neighbor. Eric had always dreamed of a quiet life, far removed from the noise of the city. His new home, nestled in a rural village surrounded by rolling hills and dense woods, seemed like the perfect retreat. The air was crisp, the nights were silent save for the occasional hoot of an owl, and his nearest neighbor was a good few hundred meters away, just the way he liked it. But solitude, Eric would soon learn, has its own peculiar ways of making its presence felt. It began with the light. Every night, just as the clock struck 10, Eric would notice a faint, flickering glow coming from the house next door. The property was a weathered old structure, its windows clouded with grime and shutters hanging askew. From what Eric had been told, it had been abandoned for years. At first, he dismissed the light as a trick of his tired eyes or perhaps a reflection from some distant source. But each night, it persisted, soft, golden, and rhythmically pulsing, like an old gas lantern being carried from room to room. Curiosity gnawed at him. One evening, armed with a flashlight and his dog, Max, Eric decided to investigate. As he approached the property, Max began to growl, low and guttural, his hackles rising. Eric shone his flashlight toward the house, but the light inside vanished instantly. The house stared back at him, dark and lifeless. The next morning, he brought it up at the village market. "You must mean the old Miller place," said Mrs. Hawthorne, a sprightly woman in her 70s. Her expression faltered as soon as Eric mentioned the light. "I wouldn't pay it any mind, dear. Probably just the wind catching something shiny." "The wind doesn't make lights flicker," Eric replied, bemused. Others nearby exchanged uneasy glances. The butcher, a burly man named Tom, leaned in and whispered, "Best not to poke around there. Some things are better left alone." Their discomfort only fueled Eric's determination. Why were they so unwilling to talk about it? And why did they react as if he brought up something taboo? That evening, Eric stayed up late, watching the house from his bedroom window. At precisely 10 o'clock, the light appeared again. This time, it seemed closer to the window on the second floor, as if someone or something was looking back at him. He felt a chill creep up his spine, but he was also resolute. Tomorrow, he decided he'd visit the house in daylight. Whatever was going on, he was going to get to the bottom of it. The next morning, Eric set out just after sunrise, Max trotting reluctantly by his side. The old Miller place loomed before him, its roof sagging under the weight of years. Weeds and vines clung to the walls, giving it an almost predatory appearance. The front door was slightly ajar. "Hello," Eric called out, stepping inside cautiously. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something faintly metallic. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet as he moved through the house, his flashlight sweeping across peeling wallpaper and dust-covered furniture. He found no signs of recent habitation, no footprints, no moved objects, nothing to suggest that anyone had been there in years. Yet the light had been so vivid, so deliberate. As Eric climbed the stairs to the second floor, he noticed something odd, the faint scent of burning wax. He followed it to a small room at the end of the hallway. Inside, he found an antique candelabra sitting on the floor. Its candles were freshly melted, their wax pooling onto the floorboards. A sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut behind him. Eric spun around, his heart hammering in his chest. He tried the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. Panic began to rise as he pounded on the door, shouting for help. And then he heard it, a soft whisper, like a distant echo, coming from the corner of the room. "Why did you come?" Eric's flashlight flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. But the light returned, this time from the candelabra, its flames springing back to life on their own. Shadows danced along the walls, growing taller and more grotesque with each passing moment. Eric didn't wait to find out what would happen next. With a force born of desperation, he threw his weight against the door until it finally gave way. Max barked furiously as Eric stumbled down the stairs and out into the daylight, his breath coming in ragged gasps. When he reached his own house, he locked every door and window, vowing never to set foot in the Miller place again. But as the sun set that evening, Eric couldn't resist a final glance toward the old house. At precisely 10 o'clock, the light flickered on once more. This time, it didn't fade. Instead, it grew brighter and brighter, illuminating a figure standing at the window, a pale, unmoving silhouette. And Eric swore, for just a moment, it waved. Eric's nights were sleepless after his encounter at the Miller house. The flickering light, the shadowy figure, and the whispers all gnawed at his mind. But more than fear, it was curiosity that drove him. He needed answers. Under the cover of night, armed with his flashlight, a crowbar, and Max by his side, Eric set out once more. The village was silent, the only sounds being the crunch of gravel under his boots and the occasional hoot of an owl. The Miller house loomed in the moonlight, its cracked windows glinting like broken eyes. The door was ajar, just as it had been before, but this time Eric noticed something new, a faint trail of dirt leading inside, as though someone had recently entered. Eric stepped over the threshold, Max whimpering quietly behind him. The air inside was colder than he remembered, and the metallic scent from his previous visit was stronger, almost suffocating. He started his search systematically, combing through each room. In the living room, he discovered a pile of old family photos scattered across the floor. The faces in the pictures were blurred with age, but one image caught his eye, a woman in a white dress standing in front of the very house he was in. Her expression was solemn, her eyes hauntingly sharp despite the faded quality of the print. Moving upstairs, Eric found a dusty diary tucked under a bed in what appeared to be a child's room. The pages were brittle, filled with neat, looping handwriting. Most entries were mundane, descriptions of the weather, chores, and fleeting moments of joy. But as Eric read further, the tone shifted. September 12th, I hear her at night, the one they all say vanished. They call her the Vanishing Neighbor. She whispers my name. September 22nd, she was at my window again. They don't believe me. They say it's just my imagination. October 1st, I think she wants me to join her. Eric's hands trembled as he flipped to the final entry, the ink smeared as though written in a hurry. October 15th, if anyone finds this, don't stay. She's always watching. She's always waiting. A loud creak echoed from somewhere downstairs. Eric froze, his grip tightening on the diary. Max growled, low and menacing, his ears perked toward the sound. "Hello," Eric called out, his voice barely above a whisper. There was no reply, only the oppressive silence of the house. As he descended the stairs, flashlights sweeping the darkened rooms, Eric's foot hit something small and metallic. He bent down to pick it up, a locket. Opening it, he found a tiny portrait of the same woman from the photograph, her expression now eerily more intense. The air grew colder still. Eric's breath formed visible puffs as he heard it again. The whisper, faint and dragging, like dry leaves scraping against pavement. "Eric!" The sound was unmistakable, and it was coming from the living room. Slowly, he turned the corner, and the light from his flashlight landed on an impossible sight. The figure from the window stood there, her pale face glowing faintly in the dark. Her eyes locked onto Eric's, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. She raised one hand slowly, pointing toward the front door. Eric didn't wait to see what she would do next. Grabbing Max's collar, he bolted out of the house, his legs carrying him faster than they ever had before. The sound of whispers followed him, growing louder and more frantic, until he reached his home and slammed the door shut behind him. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and confusion. Eric stayed up, every light in his house blazing, Max lying protectively at his feet. At sunrise, he ventured outside cautiously to assess his surroundings. What he found sent a fresh wave of terror through him. His belongings, clothes, books, even his dishes, were neatly arranged in the yard, as though someone had packed them up for him. On top of the pile was the diary, open to the final entry, with a new line scrawled beneath the original text. "You should have listened." Eric's hands shook as he backed away from the scene, his mind racing. Who or what had been in that house? And why did it seem so intent on making him leave? As he packed his car later that morning, determined to put the village behind him, Eric glanced one last time toward the Miller house. The light flickered in the second-story window, steady and unyielding, as if bidding him a silent farewell. He didn't wave back. Story 3. The Forgotten Child. The Martinez family had hoped their new home would offer a fresh start, a place of comfort after years of feeling cramped and overwhelmed in their old apartment. The house, a large Victorian-style structure tucked away on a quiet street in the city, seemed perfect for their small family. With its tall windows, winding staircases, and intricate woodwork, it had a charm that felt almost like a fairy tale, albeit one that had seen better days. But as the wind howled outside and snow dusted the cobblestone roads, something about the house felt off to Laura from the very beginning. Still, she kept these thoughts to herself, not wanting to dampen the excitement Mark and their 8-year-old son, Ethan, felt. It wasn't long before they began to settle in, unpacking boxes and filling the rooms with familiar warmth. But as the first frost of winter crept into the house, so too did an unsettling presence. At night, the cold seemed to seep into the walls, making the house feel like a tomb rather than a home. And with the night came the sound. At first, it was faint, a barely audible sobbing, so quiet that Laura thought she must have imagined it. But when Ethan came to her the following night, eyes wide with fear, she couldn't dismiss it any longer. "Mom, I keep hearing a baby crying in the walls," Ethan said, his voice trembling. He had always been sensitive to sounds, but this was different. His fear was palpable. Laura smiled nervously, brushing his hair away from his face. "It's just your imagination, sweetheart," she reassured him, though her voice lacked conviction. "There's no baby here." Mark, who had been listening from the kitchen, chuckled softly. "Ethan, there are no babies in the walls. It's probably just the house settling, making strange noises." He gave his son a playful ruffle on the head, but Ethan wasn't convinced. "It's not just in the walls," he insisted, clutching his blanket tighter. "It's in the nursery room. It's right by the crib." Laura exchanged a glance with Mark, a flicker of unease passing between them. But they said nothing. The next few nights were the same. The crying, ever so faint at first, grew louder. Laura tried to ignore it, telling herself it was the wind or some creak in the old house, but the sound persisted. It was as if it came from everywhere and nowhere all at once, lingering in the air just out of reach. Then, one evening, while Mark was out for a late meeting, Laura was in the kitchen when she heard it too, a soft, wailing cry that echoed down the hallway. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. The noise was coming from the nursery. Without thinking, Laura rushed down the hall to the room. She opened the door to find the nursery just as it had been all day, quiet and empty. Ethan's stuffed animals were neatly arranged in the crib, and the moonlight filtered softly through the curtains, casting a gentle glow on the wooden floor. But as she stepped into the room, the crying grew louder. Her pulse quickened. She stood frozen in the doorway, listening. The sound was not coming from outside, not from the walls. It was as if it was coming from the very air itself. "Hello?" Laura called, her voice shaking. "Is someone there?" The crying stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence hanging in the air. Laura's breath caught in her throat. She took a cautious step forward, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. Suddenly, there was a soft rustling behind her. She spun around, but no one was there. Just the empty, cold hallway. Her mind raced as she backed out of the room, her heart pounding in her chest. She hurried to Ethan's room, where he had fallen asleep, and stood in the doorway, watching him for a long moment. The child was deeply asleep, his small chest rising and falling in the rhythmic pattern of innocence. Yet, even as she stood there, she could still hear the faintest remnants of the cry, echoing in the distance. The next morning, Mark was the first to mention it. He had stayed late at work the night before, and when he came home, Laura was sitting in the living room, her hands trembling around a cup of coffee. "Have you been hearing things?" he asked, his eyes searching her face for any sign of unease. Laura nodded, not bothering to hide the strain in her voice. "It's the nursery. I can hear the crying." Mark looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed and dropped his coat onto the couch. "It's just an old house, Laura. It creaks, it moans, it plays tricks on us. I'm sure there's an explanation." But Laura wasn't so sure. By that evening, the crying had grown even louder, almost unbearable. The walls seemed to hum with the sound, reverberating through every corner of the house. And it wasn't just Ethan anymore. Laura had been sitting in the living room when she heard it again, this time unmistakable. It was no longer a soft wail, but a sharp, desperate cry, as though the baby was in pain. She could no longer dismiss it as a figment of imagination. It was real. She ran to the nursery, but it was empty. Nothing was out of place. But as she stood there, the crying filled the room, and Laura knew that whatever haunted this house had been waiting. It had been waiting for her. The haunting was just beginning. The unsettling cries continued each night, growing louder, more desperate. But even with the growing tension, Mark remained skeptical. To him, the noises were just the echoes of an old house, playing tricks on their minds. He had always been the practical one, the one who believed in explanations rooted in reality. So, when Laura insisted they couldn't ignore the eerie happenings anymore, Mark decided to prove her wrong. He took it upon himself to renovate the nursery, thinking that fixing the room, giving it a fresh coat of paint, and moving around the furniture might finally bring peace. The project started innocently enough. Mark ripped up the old carpet, eager to replace it with something new and clean. He had no idea that beneath the floorboards lay a dark secret, one that had been hidden away for years, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. As he worked late into the night, sweat dripping down his brow, Mark felt a strange unease settling in his chest. The house, which had once seemed like a dream, now felt more like a tomb. The walls groaned as if they too were trying to escape from something they couldn't quite remember. It was during one of these late-night sessions that Mark's hand brushed against something solid under the floorboards. His heart skipped a beat, and he carefully pried the loose floorboard away, revealing a small compartment hidden beneath. He reached into the dusty, dark recess and pulled out a tattered baby blanket, its fabric worn with age. Along with it, a crumpled letter, its edges yellowed with time, fell into his hands. His pulse quickened as he unrolled the letter. The handwriting was faded, but it was still legible. "My dearest child, I fear the house has taken you. The screams have stopped, but the silence haunts me. You are not the first to suffer here, and you will not be the last. May you find peace where I could not. Yours forever, a mother who failed." Mark's hands trembled as he read the haunting words over and over. The letter spoke of a child, a death, and an undeniable sense of guilt. He felt his stomach churn, a wave of nausea washing over him. His practical mind struggled to reconcile the letter's chilling message with the logical world he clung to. Who had written this? And why was it hidden under the floor of their home? Suddenly, the faint sound of a baby's cry filled the air. It was distant at first, barely a whisper, but it grew louder, more urgent, until it seemed to shake the walls themselves. Mark dropped the letter and blanket, stumbling backward. His heart raced as he turned toward the nursery, where the crying now echoed loudly, as if it was coming from within the walls. The sound was deafening. "Laura!" Mark shouted, his voice shaky. "Laura, we need to leave. Something's wrong. Something's really wrong." But Laura was already standing at the doorway, her face pale as she watched him. Her eyes widened in horror as the crying intensified, filling the entire house. She reached out for Mark's hand, her fingers cold and trembling. "The letter," Mark whispered, pointing to the crumpled paper on the floor. There was a child here, a child who died. He paused, his mind trying to process the words that had been written so many years ago. A child who died under mysterious circumstances. And now it's here. The crying, it's real. Laura could feel the weight of the words pressing down on her chest. The nursery, once a symbol of hope for their family, had become a suffocating place of despair. She glanced at Ethan's room down the hall, where her son had been sleeping soundly just hours earlier. But now, she felt a strange pull to the nursery, a compulsion to find answers, no matter the cost. As they stood there, frozen in the nursery doorway, a sudden cold swept over them. The temperature in the room dropped drastically, and the air felt thick with an oppressive heaviness. The cries were now deafening, so loud that it felt as though the house itself was shaking. Mark turned to Laura, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to get out of here. Now!" But as he spoke, the nursery door slammed shut with a force that sent them both stumbling backward. The cries stopped abruptly, and in the silence that followed, a feeling of overwhelming sadness washed over the room. It was as if the house itself was grieving, mourning for the child who had never known peace. "Ethan," Laura gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She turned and ran down the hall to her son's room, her heart pounding in her chest. Mark followed closely behind, his legs heavy with fear. When they reached Ethan's door, Laura's breath caught in her throat. Ethan was standing in the doorway, staring into the darkness of the hallway. But it wasn't the boy she knew. The child before her was still, unnervingly still, as if frozen in place. Then, from the shadows, a figure began to emerge. It was the shadow of a child, no older than Ethan himself, standing motionless in the doorway. It was a dark silhouette, its features distorted and faint, but its presence was undeniable. "Ethan!" Laura screamed, rushing forward to pull her son away from the figure. But as she reached him, the shadow vanished, leaving nothing but a chilling emptiness in its wake. They were no longer alone. Mark stood beside her, his face ashen, his eyes wide with fear. The air was thick with a strange energy, an overwhelming sadness that clung to the room like a thick fog. The house seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, as if the very walls were alive, breathing in the sorrow that filled the air. I can't do this anymore," Mark said, his voice cracking. "We need to leave. We need to leave right now." And so, they did. The Martinez family left the house that night, unable to shake the feeling of the unseen presence that lingered behind them. As they packed their belongings, the cries continued to echo through the empty house, fading only as they drove away, disappearing into the night. The house, with its haunted nursery and sorrowful history, was left behind, but its memory would never be erased. The truth had been uncovered, but it had come at a cost. The house had been forgotten for a reason, and now the Martinez family would never forget what they had found beneath its floorboards. Each of these stories serves as a reflection of our deepest fears, the vulnerabilities we often wish to ignore but cannot escape. In The Silent Stalker, the fear of being watched becomes all-consuming. Claire's seemingly safe, new home transforms into a claustrophobic prison as the invisible presence in her life grows more tangible. It is not just about the fear of an intruder. It is the dread of not knowing who is observing you, of losing control over the boundaries that should protect you. This story taps into our primal anxiety, the uncertainty of not being alone when we thought we were, the unsettling feeling that someone knows too much about us. The Vanishing Neighbor shifts focus to the terror of isolation. Eric, in his quiet rural home, begins to unravel the mystery of his neighbor's house. As he digs deeper, he realizes that the eerie light is not just a sign of a long-forgotten past, but a clue to something far darker, a history that refuses to be forgotten. The Vanishing Neighbor speaks to the unsettling isolation that small communities can harbor, where people who have disappeared are sometimes buried deeper than just their bodies. The fear of being alone is compounded by the knowledge that the people around you may not be who they seem, or worse, may not even be there at all. Finally, the forgotten child explores grief that lingers long after its source has vanished. The crying child in the walls, the hidden letter, the ghost of a child whose life was cut short too soon, all symbolize the unresolved sorrow that refuses to be laid to rest. The house itself seems to be a monument to the grief that has soaked into every corner, a constant reminder that some wounds are never fully healed. In this story, the fear comes not from the terror of the child's presence, but from the silent, aching sorrow that clings to the house, an emotion that will forever haunt those who dare to listen to its cry. In all three tales, we find a common thread: the fear of the unknown and the unexplainable. These stories echo the universal dread of encountering forces we cannot control, forces that tug at the very fabric of our understanding. The unknown is a force of nature that, in the end, reveals how fragile we truly are. It speaks not just to the fear of what we might find, but to our inability to predict, control, or escape it. These are true stories, or so they say. But perhaps the scariest part isn't that they happened. It's that they could happen to you. We often distance ourselves from the supernatural, claiming it's all just stories to entertain or frighten. But what if these tales aren't just figments of the imagination? What if, just beyond the veil of the ordinary, there are things we cannot comprehend, forces we cannot see, but that are ever present, waiting for the moment when they reveal themselves? In these stories, the characters thought they were safe. They thought their lives were under control. But the true horror wasn't in the things they saw. It was in the things they couldn't explain. And that is the scariest part of all. The realization that what you fear might not be a tale at all, but an invitation to confront something real. Fear often thrives in the dark spaces of the mind, the places where logic and reason fail to shine light. It arises from our inability to explain the inexplicable. It thrives when we are left with questions, when the answers slip just out of reach. That is where the real terror lies, not in the things we can see and touch, but in the shadows of the things we can't. Have you ever felt watched, alone, or unsettled by something you couldn't explain? Perhaps you've experienced something that still lingers in the corners of your memory. We invite you to share your own stories. Whether it's a whisper in the dark, an odd occurrence that defies logic, or an experience that left you with more questions than answers, your story is a part of the ever-growing cycle of storytelling. The fear that unites us all is the fear of the unknown. So share your story and keep the cycle alive. Let us remember that while we may fear what we cannot explain, we are not alone in our terror. Others, too, are living with the same unease. And together, we can face whatever lies beyond the veil.